Good morning. Title of the sermon on this Father's Day, Faith of Our Fathers, a Father's Day sermon. So 3 short scriptures, you can kind of see the connection. From Proverbs 22:6, teach children how they should live, and they will remember it all their life. From Exodus 20, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord is giving you. It's not just long in terms of longevity, it's fullness as well. And from 1 Corinthians 13, now faith, hope, and love abide forever. These 3, and the greatest of these is love. So this is my last regular sermon at Point Pleasant. And over 6 years. And during those 6 years here, one of the things that has really emerged to me is a great deal of interest in the effects of trauma, particularly childhood trauma. And so over time, a number of times, I've lifted up the Adverse Childhood Experience Inventory known as ACEs. That's right. Each of these childhood experiences deeply affect the life of the person who experienced them. I'll just read them through. Verbal abuse, physical abuse of self or of a parent, sexual abuse, hunger, divorce, being belittled, devalued, disparaged repeatedly, mental illness in the household, alcoholism and or drug addiction, suicide or death of a parent, imprisonment in the household. Kaiser has built their entire therapeutic model for mental and emotional healing and well-being, incorporating this ACE inventory. And really the entire field of treating and healing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is really based on a growing understanding that we are deeply affected by traumatic experiences in our life. The good news is that regardless of one's ACE score, right, there is hope. There's good news. Help and healing and wholeness is achievable through therapy, which is in its most basic level, is simply structured dialogue, externalizing what often is held in secret within us. For some people, medications. For some people, prayer and meditation. For some people, active involvement in a faith community. That's right. Physical care. For some people, physical care or self-exercise, walking, yoga can have a dramatic effect. And finally, for many people, the power of telling their story, their family story, verbally or in writing. Now, during the pandemic, I've become much more aware of the significance of both the positive as well as the adverse experiences in life. That's right. That the traumatic experience can warp us, but often responding to them can transform us in positive ways. Now, I've just shared 6 ways of pursuing healing and wholeness, and the 6th was the power of telling your family story. And on this Father's Day, I want to share a portion of my family story, focusing on my dad and his story. Much of this is from a Father's Day sermon that I preached a few years ago. My dad was born June 13, 1927 in Baltimore, Maryland. He was born into a tight-knit Jewish family. In the early years of the Great Depression, 1933 to be exact, when my dad was 6, the family business collapsed. His mother died in 1938 and his father died 5 years later in 1943 in the midst of the biggest war the world had ever known. His older brother Jerry had enlisted in the Navy the year before, so my dad was all alone when his dad died, rather suddenly, of a heart attack. He was 52. A few years ago, I shared in a story from Dave in our newsletter about my dad's 2 most prized possessions in his childhood, his coin collection and a baseball that he was able to get signed by both Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and how both of these came to be taken away. He volunteered his coin collection to pay the rent after his mother had died when they were really destitute. But it was the loss of that signed baseball and the circumstances surrounding it that resulted in certainly one of the most painful, adverse childhood experiences of my dad's life. In 1943, when his dad died, his wealthy Uncle Kaufman was to take care of my dad. He was all alone. His brother was serving in the Navy in World War II. Now, this arrangement for Uncle Kaufman to take care of my dad, if anything would happen to his father, who had just died, had been prearranged. My dad and his father had been living in a cheap, rundown residential hotel with one common bathroom per floor in Washington, D.C. His Uncle Kaufman lived 35 miles away in a mansion in Baltimore. Yet after his father died, he waited for his Uncle Kaufman to come for him as was arranged. A week went by. 2 weeks went by. 3 weeks went by, but no Uncle Kaufman. Finally, after 4 weeks, my dad took the train to Baltimore and walked to Uncle Kaufman's house. Although he was given a room, it was made absolutely clear to my dad in numerous ways that he wasn't wanted there. So less than a month later, he ran away, taking a job as a wiper, working in the hot boiler rooms of the small steamships that worked the Chesapeake Bay. He left most of his belongings behind when he ran away, including his autographed baseball. Over the next couple of months, his Aunt Celeste and Uncle Mort, who lived in Cincinnati, found out that their nephew, my dad, Richard, had run away. And they went searching for my dad. Considering it was the middle of World War II, the chances of finding my dad were slim to none, yet they doggedly searched and searched, and by the grace of God, they found him and took him home with them to Cincinnati. Their home became his home. 2 years later, at age 17, he would enlist in the Merchant Marines and ship out during the summer of 1945 after Germany had surrendered, but as the United States was preparing for a likely invasion of Japan. Had Japan not surrendered, and the invasion of Japan taken place, I probably wouldn't be here today. My dad remained in the Merchant Marines as a sailor after the war, but in mid-1946, he called his Uncle Kaufman to arrange to come by to retrieve the one item of value that he possessed, his Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig autographed baseball. However, on the phone, Uncle Kaufman told him that his son, my dad's cousin, had used the ball in a baseball game, and it had been lost. My dad would go on to forgive just about every human being that ever wronged him throughout his life. My dad simply never held grudges. Yet the two people that he could never forgive were Uncle Kaufman and Uncle Kaufman's son. He never spoke to either of them for the rest of his life. Yet as painful as the betrayal of his Uncle Kaufman, it created within my dad one of his greatest gifts, his love, appreciation, and loyalty to family and friends. Aunt Celeste and Uncle Mort searching and eventually finding my dad after he had run away and then inviting him to live with them as family was one of the formative events in his life, and by extension in my life. Out of that trauma, he experienced this incredible gift. From 1945, when he went away to war, to the end of his life, my dad wrote them every single week, and they wrote him back. In fact, that practice of writing the people who loved him and whom he loved was something my dad did up until the day he died of a heart attack in 2004. In addition, my dad saved nearly all those letters he received, thousands of them. They were in a large bureau in our home, in our living room growing up. And for each of those letters he received, there were probably 2 or 3 others that he had written. For my sister Wynn and I growing up, my dad writing letters, 8 to 10 per week, was among the most indelible images of our childhood. Through the end of the 1940s and through most of the 1950s, my dad would serve would be a sailor. He was a purser, the payroll accountant on a ship in the Merchant Marines, except for the 2 years he served in combat in the Army during the Korean War. Until finally, he and my mom were married in San Francisco in 1957. My dad's education had ceased when he was 15 upon his father's death. Yet in the mid-1950s, when he was in his mid-20s, he took the GED and then began taking extension courses at UC Berkeley. All through my childhood, in addition to my dad's day job as an accountant for the civilian arm of the Navy called Military Sealift Command, he was also, in the evening, a student, driving to take classes on the UC Berkeley campus a couple of evenings each week, which is one of the reasons I went to Berkeley. My dad was a workaholic, and there was an underside to that, including a great deal of stress that he placed upon himself. He nonetheless had the strongest work ethic of any person I've ever known. My dad worked his way up through the civil service system, and when he retired following a nearly fatal automobile accident in 1975, he was at GS, Government Service 14, with GS 15 being the highest level. He was one of a small handful of GS 14s in the United States to not have a college degree. My dad also had a second job, his Saturday job, as a stockbroker. Many Saturdays through my growing up years, I went in with him to Frank Knowlton and Company, a small brokerage firm on 12th and Broadway in downtown Oakland. There he worked, but he also taught me how to navigate the world of investing, stocks and bonds, something that has deeply affected me throughout my life. There I also got to meet his amazing boss, Charlie Jenks, whose best friend was George Blanda, then the place kicker for the Oakland Raiders. And yes, Mr. Jenks, with the assistance of George Blanda, would get us tickets for my mom and I, not my dad and I, but my mom and I to go to at least one Raider game every single year at the Oakland Coliseum. Mr. Jenks owned the company, and he became like a second father to my dad. One Saturday, when I went in with Mr. Jenks, went in with my dad, Mr. Jenks showed me the new Xerox machine, and we both played with it, making copies of our faces pressed down on the glass. It was also on that day that Mr. Jenks said to me, using a phrase that became a part of our family lexicon, he said, "David, there's one thing about your dad that is more important in my eyes than anything else. Your dad has the common touch. He treats every person the same, from Leon the black man who runs our elevator in the building here to millionaire corporate bosses. I strive to have the common touch myself, and I hope you will as well." That common touch led to one of my dad's greatest gifts, incredible relational loyalty to everyone that he was connected with. My dad honored and valued relationships with family and friends with an incredible fierceness and love. You see, the betrayal my dad experienced from his Uncle Kaufman had turned redemptive for my dad. He would never abandon, turn, reject, or chastise a family member or a friend, and my dad had hundreds and hundreds of friends. There were numerous displays of this loyalty scattered throughout my life. Him driving hundreds of miles in the middle of the night to bail out a friend who was in jail. Overlooking again and again a family member repeatedly using the racist and derogatory term kike, and continuing to sincerely love that family member. And most significantly, making it clear to every family member and friend he was in relationship with that their relationship was unconditional. And nothing would change that as far as he was concerned, period. And while my dad almost never directly rebuked someone who acted out with anti-Semitism or racism, he did respond in a particular way that leveraged, in some ways that honored the relationship. My dad would pull out his prayer book, that's right, his Jewish prayer book, and he would pray the Kaddish prayer, sometimes in Hebrew, sometimes in English. And here's this prayer. May the great name of God be exalted and sanctified throughout the world, which he has created according to his will. May his kingship be established in your lifetime and in your life and in your days. That's right. And in the lifetime of the entire household of Israel, swiftly and in the near future. And say, amen. That's right. He would pray that prayer. He'd make it clear that he was Jewish. He was also Christian, but he was deeply Jewish. This person that they had disparaged, that's the way he would respond. In 1975, my dad nearly died when my parents were in an automobile accident in Reno. Tragically, our son, Tedessa, would die in an automobile accident in Las Vegas 43 years later. The accident left him a severely shattered pelvis and a serious concussion. This this struggle with chronic pain was with him for the rest of his life until his death 29 years later. However, the far bigger consequence was that he struggled with severe bipolar cycles. My dad was diagnosed bipolar before his accident. In fact, he became extremely close with his Kaiser therapist, Dr. Rodman, initially a secular therapist who married a congregational minister and became one of the persons who most strongly encouraged me into ministry. And by the way, practiced pastoral counseling as a Kaiser therapist. Well, the accident caused my dad's bipolar cycles to become far more extreme. His highs were very, very manic, and his lows were very, very depressed. My sister Wynn is also bipolar, as was our son Tedessa. So mental illness runs deep in our family. That's one of the reasons why I so appreciate during my time here at Point Pleasant the fact that we have become friends with David Bartley. It's one of the persons I plan to bring to Los Altos as well as a friend, of him coming here as a guest preacher to preach about mental health. In 2004, when my dad died of a heart attack, just like his grandfather and his father and his brother Jerry before him, he was in a manic phase. That's right, which almost certainly contributed to his heart attack. When I take the ACEs test, I mark yes on being traumatically affected by mental illness in my growing up. In fact, dealing with mental illness has become one of the most significant dimensions of my ministry over the last 32 years. My dad experienced at least four of the ACE inventory experiences, and some of them, such as hunger, for a protracted period of time. I have little doubt that my dad's bipolar mental illness was at least partially the result of the trauma he experienced in his childhood. Now, I shared that story of my dad a few years ago, and it's not hard to see the connection with these three wonderful scriptures. I just share them with you again. From Proverbs 22, teach children how they should live, and they will remember it all their life. In Exodus 20, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that your Lord is giving you. And from 1 Corinthians 13, so now faith, hope, and love abide forever, these three, and the greatest of these is love. It's not hard for me to connect these scriptures to my dad and to my life through him. Yet on this last Sunday of preaching regular, next Sunday we don't have a traditional sermon, we're going to do some other things. On this last sermon, I want to share a few recent epiphanies that have emerged, and I realized that they came out of my father's life, and I didn't really know that until just this week. So here are these new epiphanies, and they all are centered on what Romans 12, which is our last scripture for this day, where Paul writes, here's the key to it all. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, to the thinking of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. There is no doubt that trauma affects the way we think. And unfortunately, the pattern of the world is for trauma to affect our thinking in very destructive ways. That's why that ACE inventory is often so significant to understand. Unredeemed, it's almost always negative. And yet, I see in my dad, and I'm not even sure all the ways it happened, but I see in my dad how those traumatic events turned into redemption in his life and in mine. How those experiences, which certainly left their mark in some negative ways, his mental illness was one aspect of that. But many of them he was able to come to a new way of thinking that was wonderfully redeemed. And I'm going to share three. This renewing of the mind that happened for him. These are what I call my legacy truths from my dad. Most of you know my adage. You never want to overpromise and underdeliver. Instead, you always want to underpromise and overdeliver. That came especially out of my dad's experience of his Uncle Kaufman. Of his Uncle Kaufman promising and then underdelivering, and how devastating that was to him, and how he never wanted that to be replicated in his life. He wanted to do just the opposite. That's deep within my dad. I hope to make it deep within me. That's part of the renewing of his mind. The second one, that term, the common touch, as Mr. Jenks would talk about. You've heard me share a number of times one of the great saints in my life, Ken Meese, who had this quality. Ken would seek to discover something within you that he sincerely felt was amazing. And he would always find something. Ken made you feel like you were the smartest, most insightful person in the world. My dad did that. I realized one of the reasons why Ken Meese so deeply impacted me, by the way, I got to know Ken Meese just 2 years after my dad died, was that's what my dad did. That's what my dad did. He would find in every human being he countered, he would find something that amazed him. And he would connect with that. That was that common touch. He always found something. And even when there were dark things that came up in that person, like family member that would use the word kike, here sitting at the Thanksgiving table, and this word kike is used, one that he had heard throughout his life. Instead of responding that way, he would honor the relationship. That's right. And the way he honored that relationship connects with this last legacy truth that I realize. That he would respond in a way that would not allow a term that I've been using a lot lately, this divisive toxicity that is seeped into our world, that has seeped into our politics, seeped into so many churches, has seeped into many families, and just torn families apart. My dad would not allow that to happen. No matter how dark he experienced in someone that he loved, he would find a way to not demonize them. That's right. Which is what we talked about, how you respond. Careful attention to avoiding language, a divided, judgmental language, right, which causes reactionary responses, and most of all, not demonizing people or groups of people in any way. You truly can disagree without demonizing. That came from my father and how he responded. Not with that direct confrontation that we're so used to, because he believed that it wouldn't be effective. Instead, he'd whip out his Kaddish prayer. That's right. And he'd pray this prayer, reminding this person that he was deeply Jewish. That's right. Not calling him out, just letting them know. He would leverage the relationship. He knew they loved him, and he loved them. And this was his way of loving them. And so out of a high ACE score, I realized that my dad transformed in redemptive ways. Yeah. That renewing of his mind that came out of it, that in a sense, maybe more than any human being I'm aware of, he did not allow that conforming into the world, of becoming an angry and bitter and resentful person, always, grinding his axe on those grievances that had happened to him throughout his life. No, just exactly the opposite, through a renewal of his mind, so that he was able to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so those 3 legacy truths I leave with you. You never want to overpromise and underdeliver. Instead, you want to underpromise and overdeliver. And that common touch, like Ken Meese and my dad, finding in others, always finding in others something that excites you, that you find amazing. Make that person feel like the smartest, most insightful person in the world. And finally, not allowing the divisive toxicity of our world into your life. And so on this day, this Father's Day, I share some of my father, and I hope you will find within your fathers a faith this day that is redemptive for you. A Father's Day sermon. Amen.